I'm happy to acknowledge the vital time, talent, and logistical supports that we receive from the University of Iowa International programs from the University of Iowa Honors Program, as well as the ongoing support of the Stanley University of Iowa Foundation Support Organization. And let me, in particular, thank today's special financial sponsors, John Menninger and Midwest One Bank. Their support makes our programs possible. I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague from the Political Science Department, Sara Mitchell. As I said, she's professor and currently serving as chair of our department. She received her BS in Economics and Political Science from Iowa State University in 1991 and her Ph.D. in Political Science from Michigan State University in 1997. She came to the U of I in 2004 after having taught for 6 years at Florida State. She's published many books and articles on a range of topics that relate to international politics, as well as on quantitative research methods. She's won grants from the Department of Defense, the National Science Foundation, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. She received a U of I Faculty Scholar Award for 2007 through 10, the Collegiate Scholar Award in 2011, and the Outstanding Faculty Mentor Award in 2012. Plus, last year, she was tabbed for the Quincy Wright Distinguished Scholar Award from the International Studies Association. One of her key disciplinary contributions has been a project to create a large-scale database on the issue correlates of war. This important data set, known as ICO, provides a systematic collection of the claims that countries have made against others in the run-up to conflict. Sara has focused in particular on disputed river and maritime claims. So we're very fortunate today to have her come and share her expertise with us. Please join me in welcoming Sara Mitchell.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and to the council for inviting me to speak today. I have been interested in water conflicts for a long time. You might wonder how I got interested in them. I started my career studying why democracies were peaceful with each other. And I started looking at when democracies have conflicts, what are they fighting about? And it turns out democracies have a lot of clashes over fishing areas and maritime zones and water issues. And that got me interested in studying more broadly the connection between water issues and international conflict. Now, when I was in graduate school, there was a lot of research at the time that was talking about the impending water wars that might be coming. So in the 80s, a lot of people were warning that there would be water wars in the Middle East. People were talking about how conflicts over the Jordan River, over the Nile, a lot of the major basins could potentially lead to war between the countries that were located on these river basins. And there are some studies that do find a relationship between countries sharing river basins and having militarized conflicts. But there haven't been the large-scale wars that a lot of people have predicted. And so one question is, why hasn't that occurred, or is it just not occurred yet? There's also in the Civil War literature an interest in how climate factors are related to civil conflicts. And so a lot of scholars started collecting information on things like temperatures or annual rainfall and connecting that to conflict inside countries. And interestingly, I would characterize the findings in that literature as somewhat weak, that there are not strong statistical relationships between climate variables and civil conflicts. And so again, we're expecting to observe climate factors as being something that will increase conflict, but we're not really seeing a lot of evidence when we look at a large number of cases. And so this is also puzzling because there's some really good case studies that have been done on particular environmental conflicts. And today I'm going to talk about the Syrian civil war as one really plausible case study where we have a connection between environmental factors and in particular water resources and the outbreak of violence. So the project that I'm working on broadly is studying how interstate water conflicts affect countries' both their internal security risks and their external security risks. So internally, how does the presence of conflicts over, say, cross-border rivers like the Jordan River or the Nile River, how do those conflicts affect a country's internal security? So if you're a country like Israel or Jordan, how does having conflicts with your neighbors affect the propensity for violence inside your country? And then I'm also interested in how these conflicts affect your external security risks. So if you have river conflicts with your neighbors, are you more likely to then engage in militarized conflict over those issues? As I noted before, the literature suggests that countries have more often cooperated over rivers rather than had militarized engagement. So we see, for example, thousands of treaties that have been signed between countries on shared river basins globally, and those treaties have been fairly effective at helping countries mitigate their diplomatic disagreements. Now, I'm going to argue, though, that I think there's a connection between these external and internal security risks, and in particular, I think climate factors are increasing the risks that countries face internally. So while we have a pretty good network of river treaties that have been signed that help countries settle their interstate conflicts, they're still putting themselves at risk or facing risks internally from rebel groups or other insurgent groups. Okay, as Bill mentioned, I have a project that collects information on diplomatic conflicts. So the traditional way, again, when I started grad school, that we studied war is we would find all the wars in history, and then we would figure out what did they have in common. So what do they have in common? Most wars in history have been fought over disputed land borders, for example. So we can look at the wars in history and figure out what kinds of patterns they have. However, what we're missing are things that don't happen. So what about the connection between nuclear weapons and war? So you might say to yourself, I think nuclear weapons are a factor for peace, but I don't really have the data on that because if nuclear weapons have in fact preserved peace, then we don't have cases of war in history to observe. And so what we've done in this project is try to step back from just focusing on wars or militarized disputes and to actually go back to the original point of diplomatic disagreement. So if we're going to study disagreements over land borders, for example, we want to go back to the point where a government like the United States makes a claim against a government like Canada over, say, a land territory like Alaska. So we want to look in the news or in historical sources and find information about where they have diplomatic disagreements. And we have collected information on three primary types of geopolitical issues. So the first one is territorial claims, which involve contests over traditional land borders or islands like the Falkland Islands. We also collect information on maritime conflicts. So these are, you've probably seen this happening in Asia right now. So conflicts involving the Spratly Islands area or areas around Senkaku Islands, things like that. And then we also collect information on river claims, which are disagreements over access to or the quality or quantity of water that's shared between countries in a river basin. The Department of Defense grant that we recently got will allow us to collect information on a new issue, which we call identity claims. These are situations, for example, where a government like Russia makes claims on behalf of ethnic Russians living in other countries like Ukraine. And so we've just started collecting the information on a new set of types of claims. Okay, so for river conflicts, what we do is we find all rivers in the world that are at least 100 miles in length and cross at least one international boundary. And then we look to see which of those rivers has had some kind of diplomatic conflict between the governments that are existing on these basins. So just to give you a sense of how many cases we've identified, we've identified 143 conflicts between pairs of countries over their rivers from 1900 to the present, basically. And then we also have identified 841 conflicts over land borders or islands as territory. And then we've also identified 268 conflicts over maritime zones. And at the bottom, I have the percentage of times that those disputed issues became militarized, had one or more militarized dispute or war over the issue in question. And you can see, consistent with what I said earlier, that river conflicts have in fact been the least militarized issue between countries, with only about 1 in 10 of the contested river areas having any militarized conflict. And you can see, consistent with what I just told you, land border disputes are in fact a leading cause of war, being where we see 41% of the contested land borders leading to some form of conflict. Okay, so when I'm talking about river conflicts, I wanted to give you a sense for what I'm talking about. So the first one is that we can think about countries having a dispute over the river as a border. So China and the Soviet Union, for example, disputed where the boundary, or the Ussuri River boundary and Chempo Island as the boundary between those states. But more typically, we think of river conflicts arising between upstream and downstream states in river basins. So for example, you can think about what's happening in the Tigris-Euphrates basin, where you have Turkey as an upstream state and then Iraq and Syria as downstream states. Now, these conflicts can involve a lot of different types of issues. You can have water quantity issues, where, for example, Jordan complained to Israel about how much water it was releasing downstream in the Jordan River. You could also have water quality disputes, where in the Rhine River, for example, the Netherlands downstream complained about industrial pollution that was stemming from activities by upstream countries in the river basin. Or you can also have navigational rights. So Costa Rica and Nicaragua, for example, had a dispute when Nicaragua did not allow Costa Rican police vessels to operate freely on the San Juan River. So in our project, we code these diplomatic disagreements, but we also code information about what types of issues are being contested. So is the contested issue about water quantity? Is it about water quality? Or it could be both. Okay, so here's an example from the ICO data. These are the cases that we've identified involving the Tigris-Euphrates basin. And you can see here that we've identified about a dozen different diplomatic conflicts between Syria, Iraq, Syria, all three of the countries in the basin. And then you can see that some of these are still ongoing today in terms of the water allocation that the downstream countries have in the basin. Okay, so as I said, the basic question in my project is, how do these interstate diplomatic conflicts affect the chances for intrastate violence? So if Turkey and Syria have a conflict between the two governments, how does that affect the chances for civil war in Turkey and civil war in Syria? So that's a basic kind of question that I'm going to look at. And I'm also going to see which type of water issue is the most likely to increase the risks of intrastate violence. Okay, so you might say to yourself, why would it be that Turkey or Syria would be at risk for internal conflict just because the two governments have a disagreement over how much water is flowing in the river basin that they share? So I'm going to talk about three basic mechanisms that I think can help connect these internal and external security risks. So the first one is unequal access to water. So if countries depend on international rivers for part of their domestic water supply, conflict with other states in the basin could alter the amount of water available for citizens, farmers, and business owners. So you can think, for example, that Syria and Iraq depend on over 85% of their fresh water supply from the Tigris-Euphrates River basin. So as downstream countries, they're much more vulnerable to changes in the supply of water coming from the upstream area in Turkey. And if you know anything about the Greater Anatolia project in Turkey, this is a series of dozens of dams that Turkey has tried to construct in their territory on these basins, and this causes grievances among local populations, both inside Turkey and in Iraq and Syria. Now, in particular, I think that there's a couple of triggering mechanisms for violence. The first one is that I think water issues, when they're connected to ethnicity, are going to be more violence-inducing. So if you have access to water supplies that's unequal across different ethnic groups, these are the kinds of places where we are very likely to see civil wars that are connected to environmental issues. So for example, you can think about in the Jordan River Basin, for example, Palestinians have historically paid 6 times as much for water or had less access to water quantity than Israelis living in the West Bank. You can think about in the Senegal River, the Mauritanian government responded to decreases in water quantity by abrogating the right of black farmers living along the river. And that caused, as you can imagine, violence between the government and the Mauritanian citizens. Okay, so the first mechanism, I think, is simply if you have water that's coming from outside another country and then that water is unequally dispersed across different ethnic groups, then I think there's a problem. The second mechanism, which we do see in Syria, is that the change in water quantity on a river basin can displace people living along that basin. And so when you have displacement, what happens is those people move from these farming areas to cities. And we saw this, like I said, in Syria, where we had a massive movement of people out of the areas near the Tigris-Euphrates into other parts of Syria. And then some of these towns in Syria went from populations of a few thousand to over 100,000 in just a matter of 2 or 3 years. And so this put a huge amount of pressure on the water supplies in those areas that they were receiving these internally displaced people. You can think about, for example, also in the GAP project, again, the people that have been displaced because of these dams, it's not been Syrian Arabs that have been displaced. It's been really a lot of ethnic Kurds that have been displaced. So even though Kurds make up only about 9% of the population of Syria, they've been particularly harmed by the decrease in water supply, both from damming and from the drought that occurred in the mid-2000s. The Egyptian government has also, if you follow what's happened on the Nile, the Egyptian government periodically makes threats to invade their neighbors if they cut off their water supply. This is because Egyptian farmers depend on, I think over 98% of their freshwater supply comes from the Nile River Basin. So again, the Egypt is concerned because there's a really serious potential for population to be displaced out of those areas along the basin if water quantity changes. Another famous case involving population displacement was the environmental catastrophe in the Aral Sea Basin, where over 200,000 citizens of Uzbekistan were displaced because of the damming that occurred upstream by countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And so this led to displacement downstream of people living in that area. Now, as I said, when you have population displacement, that then puts pressure on water supplies in the country as a whole. And so you can imagine that if you have people moving to other areas, say Syrians that are displaced moving to other parts of Syria, then that creates a need for better water infrastructure and supply in those areas. And so governments sometimes respond to these situations by engaging in their own damming projects, and this sometimes backfires on them. So you can imagine a situation that occurred like in India where they created a damming project on the Ganges River, but they ended up displacing over 100,000 Indian citizens downstream. And there's documented fighting between villagers living along that downstream area, but also a series of lawsuits between people living in that area and the Indian government. So in my project, I have not yet looked at how governments' own damming projects affect civil violence, but that's the next obvious step for what I'm looking at. Okay, I already mentioned in Syria how the population growth in Syria was combined with this displacement in Syria, and that put a lot of pressure on the urban water supplies. Okay, so what are the basic ideas that I have about how conflicts over rivers affect intrastate violence? So the first argument that I make is that if you have more of these diplomatic conflicts with your neighbors over water issues, then you're more likely to have higher risks for intrastate conflict. And I think there's a few triggering mechanisms, like I mentioned. So the first one is that if the water supplies are unequally distributed across ethnic or religious groups, I think that's going to increase the chances for violence. If you have more people that are displaced because of water issues, I think you're more likely to see violence. And then also, I think if you're a downstream country in the basin, you're more susceptible to changes in water supply from up. So, for example, my hypothesis would be that Iraq and Syria would have higher risks for violence than Turkey in the Tigris-Euphrates basin. Okay, the second argument I make is that water quantity issues are more likely to result in interstate conflict than water quality, damming, hydroelectric power generation, or navigational issues. And in my project, I document why I think water quantity issues are particularly problematic. The first thing is that, as I noted, a lot of countries who depend on these river basins for a large percentage of their freshwater supply are particularly vulnerable to changes in that supply. But we can also think about economic solutions being more feasible for quality problems. So in the case of the Rhine River, which I mentioned earlier, the Netherlands ended up paying countries upstream, and then they regulated the company, the industries that were polluting the river. And so the Netherlands successfully reduced pollution in the Rhine by coming up with this economic solution of paying the polluters. You can also see in some instances for hydroelectric power generation where governments actually cooperate to pay the costs of building a dam. So in the Parana River, for example, Brazil and Paraguay jointly paid for the cost of building that hydroelectric power dam. So they, again, we're probably more likely to see cooperation in those situations where they're sharing the costs of managing those resources. Okay, so how do I test this idea? What I did is I took data from 3 regions, the Western Hemisphere, Western Europe, and the Middle East, and I also have data for Asia that I've looked at as well. And I look at country years from 1900 to 2001. And then so for example, Syria would enter my data every year that it's an independent country in this time period. And then I would be asking, what is the risk of Syria having each of these forms of violence in a given year? And I wanted to look at a lot of different forms of violence just to see kind of as a brush clearing exercise to kind of see what was going on there. So I used 2 different types of data sets, one which comes from Banks data set where he has a lot of kind of both mass violence measures and other forms of data conflict as well. But you can think about things like protests or riots being potentially different than anti-government demonstrations or assassination attempts on the leader. And then I also use a very common data set from the Civil War literature. This was collected by the Uppsala PRIO groups in Sweden and Norway, and they compiled information on what they call armed conflicts. And these are internal conflicts where 25 or more people are killed, and then civil wars where 1,000 or more people are killed in a given armed conflict. So this is more like traditional, what you probably think of as civil war. Okay, so I take the data from the ICO project on river claims, and so like I said, what we're looking for is official representatives of 2 or more governments making some kind of diplomatic claim to a disputed or a shared river basin. And I showed you before some of the examples in the Tigris-Euphrates basin that meet this definition. Okay, so there are 28 of these claims in the Western Hemisphere, 47 in the Middle East, and 7 in Western Europe. So it might not surprise you that the Middle East has the highest number of these issues. I think Asia has 36 dyadic claims. So Middle East is the most water scarce region that we've compiled data on, so it makes sense that there's most conflict there. And so what we do is we disaggregate, we code the data by pairs of countries. So it would be things like Israel and Jordan over this area. And what we do, what I did for this project was code how many conflicts Israel has with any of its neighbors. So Israel could have conflicts going on with multiple countries. So I coded the number of conflicts that it had from a single country perspective in a given year. So for example, Israel in 1989 has 3 conflicts with Jordan. So both Israel and Jordan would be coded as having 3 river claims in 1989. Okay, so then I also, like I said, coded information about, is the disputed river conflict, does it involve water quantity, water quality, navigational rights, or other types of issues? And then I controlled for, this is a very thin model of civil war, but I wanted to try to go back as far in time as I could. So I took data that I could get going back to 1900. And so this includes population, because countries with large populations have higher amounts of internal violence. Iron and steel production is meant to capture poverty or the lack thereof. So countries who have more economic production are less susceptible to interstate violence. And then I also included measures of democracy and a squared measure of that, because there's findings in the literature that countries who are kind of in the middle of the regime scale, that are transitioning from authoritarian to democracy status, are more susceptible to violence. Okay, I have some numbers there. I've highlighted what you should be looking for. So what you should be looking for, if you don't like statistics, is it positive? Positive means that more river conflicts, more violence. If it has little stars by it, that means that it's statistically significant at the 95% or higher level. And you can see that 9 of the 10 of the measures of interstate violence that I collected information on are positively and significantly related to interstate conflicts between countries over rivers. So even I was surprised when I ran the results at how strong the relationship was between river conflicts and all of these different forms of violence. Okay, so, but how much does it increase the risk of violence? So what I've done here is I've highlighted 0 and 1, because most countries in our data, only about 20% of countries country years that we look at have any river conflicts. So most of the time countries are not dealing with these issues, but so 20% of the time they are, so about 1 in 5 of the cases. But then among the cases where we have river conflicts that are ongoing, the modal number of cases is just 1. So most countries in any given year have just 1 conflict with their neighbors over a potential river that they share. And you can see here that even if you have just 1 issue over your shared river, it increases the risk of armed conflict, for example, by 50% in a given year, or even civil war. I mean, we're going from 2.1 in 100 to 3.1 in 100 chance, which is still small, but these are pretty sizable effects for the kinds of violence models that we study. And you can see that if you're a country like Israel and Jordan that at one time had 6 conflicts over rivers, their risks of civil wars were 829% higher in those years than in other years where they didn't have these conflicts over water. Now, like I said, I also broke apart water quantity, water quality, and other issues. And what I found was that, as expected, water quantity is highly related to many different types of violence. So we get a significant relationship between water quantity conflicts, like we see in the Jordan, in the Tigris-Euphrates, in the Nile. Those are associated with higher incidence of purges, riots, assassinations, government crises, demonstrations, revolutions, and armed conflicts. Water quality issues, like I was discussing with the Rhine, are only significantly related to riots. So water quality is not sparking violence in the same way that water quantity is. Navigational and hydroelectric dams are associated with about 3 or 4 of these measures, but not as strongly as water quantity. Now, I wanted to test whether differential access by ethnic group affected the chances for violence in these cases. And so what I did is I took a measure that's common in the Civil War literature, which is called ethnic dominance. And so here the argument is that if the major ethnic group comprises 45 to 90% of the population, that's a situation where you're more likely to get violence or civil war in that state. And in Syria, for example, the Syrian Arab group makes up 90% of the population, whereas Kurds and other groups make up the remaining 10%. And so what I did is I split the sample into cases where we have ethnic dominance and cases where we don't have that kind of ethnic distribution of groups. And you can see that there's stars on the left there at the bottom, that armed conflicts and civil wars are more likely to happen if you have river conflicts and you have ethnic dominance. So it's a combination really of unequal access by groups combined with some kind of water issues that's increasing the chances for the highest forms of violence. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that maybe there's something going on here, that having river conflicts with your neighbors, especially water quantity conflicts in terms of how many resources you're getting from that basin, increases the risks of domestic unrest and armed conflict. Countries like Israel and Jordan, at the peak of these diplomatic conflicts, had really high risks for interstate conflict. And water quantity issues are generating the highest risks for violence. So maybe the water wars that we were looking for are happening, but maybe they're not happening where we expected. So maybe water wars are happening more inside countries, affecting their internal security risks rather than conflict between countries. And in a paper I'm working on, I had an example of even during the Syrian war, when when Syria and Turkey were fighting, in the sense of Turkey providing safe haven to Syrian rebel groups, providing supplies to Syrian rebel groups. Even while all of that stuff was going on, the two governments were still meeting to plan the continued construction of a dam that they're building on the Orontes River. And so even though they are having conflict internally, they're still finding a way to cooperate between the two governments over water issues. Okay, so what do I tell when I actually presented a version of this to USAID, and they wanted to know what was my recommendations for them. And so the first thing I said is that if USAID is going to provide money to building dams around the world, these are some of the things that it needs to think about in constructing those dams. So the first thing is that they need to look at the conditions in the countries that are downstream from those areas. And so if we see ethnic dominance or the potential for ethnic and religious groups to have unequal access to water, that's a warning sign that we should look for. If there's a lot of people that are living on the river that could be displaced because of changes in water quantity, that's a risk factor. And if those conflicts between the governments have historically involved water quantity, that's another reason that we should be concerned about providing money for these kind of development projects. Now, I was in Israel this summer, and I got to go on a tour of the Golan Heights area, and it was really interesting because an Israeli general that we talked to was talking about how Israel has really changed its whole water policy by investing in these massive desalination plants. And so it was really interesting because from his perspective, the Jordan River is no longer an issue. I didn't get a chance to talk with people in the West Bank about that, but I'm guessing that we could think about desalination as a strategy for tapping into alternative sources of water, especially if we know that water quantity is a high risk factor for violence. Another strategy we could think about is encouraging cooperative resource trades. So in the Aral Sea Basin, when the Soviet Union existed, it actually mandated cotton growing in the downstream areas of the basin. And those areas that produced oil, which happened to be downstream states, would then send oil resources to the upstream states. So you had this kind of exchange of oil for water in that area. And countries today in the Aral Sea Basin continue this trade where downstream states are providing oil in exchange for upstream states, not generating, using as much water in the dams in the off season. So these are, so I think, do we have concerns about going forward? Yes, but I think we can look to the kinds of risk factors that we've identified in our work and hopefully help us identify better policies moving forward. Thank you.
Do fourth world issues, that is having to do with tribal peoples, with rivers and water, fall into interstate or civil conflicts?
In the data that we've collected, the answer would be no. We only collect information between official governments of what we consider to be states. So, for example, there are some cases involving even things like Great Lakes resources, or Canada and Minnesota and its neighboring areas in Canada have disputes that could involve, in some of these cases, tribal groups. But we do not, in this particular project, code those cases. But I think that would be a really good thing for us to look at in the future.
We've got a couple of questions that ask you to comment on, to go beyond the idea of ethnic differences in these countries and whether or not religious differences also play into this, and whether they're part of the same factor or a different dimension.
Okay, yes. In the data set that I'm using on ethnic dominance, it takes into account both ethnicity and religion. So religion can be one of the criteria that demarcates groups. I have access to some data on religious groups that I could analyze in this project, and I think that would be a really interesting extension of what I've done. But here I'm using kind of a data set that kind of combines ethnicity and religion together.
So our audience wants you to keep collecting data, I think. I'm going to read a couple of questions that maybe are loosely connected. Does your model also look at resource disputes that involve water, such as fishing disputes? And if so, are countries more likely to find a solution than if it were just a pure water or water quantity dispute? The second question, water supply and quality are often buried within other issues of inequity between, for example, India and Kashmir and Pakistan, Israel, Palestine, etc. Please comment on the multiplier effects of water, especially as population, pollution, and other demands on limited resources increase.
Okay. In terms of fishing, in our project, we do code if there's the presence of fishing in the contested area. So you could look across our cases and see the extent to which fishing is important. In the conflicts we collect over maritime areas, we code not only the presence of fishing, but the presence of migratory fish stocks. Because in our data, we find that militarized conflict over maritime areas is most likely to happen if you have migratory fish stocks. It's one of the largest. Oil, as you might imagine, is a contributing factor, although interestingly, it's not the production of oil, it's the potential for the production of oil. So in maritime zones where you have oil resources discovered but not yet extracted, you get more militarized conflict. And fishing is it's more conflict-inducing than I expected it to be in the maritime side. In terms of rivers, I don't think fishing has been as much of a conflictual issue, at least in the cases that we've looked at. Okay, is this a multiplier effect? Absolutely. When I presented this at USAID, everybody in the room was like, we don't believe this. Or we don't really buy this. We don't really buy that water conflicts are causing violence. And the answer I gave to them was that I don't think water conflicts are the only cause of violence. I think that you have to look for other factors like population, poverty, geography. There's a lot of risk factors that make civil war more likely. And so what we have to do is take those risk factors into consideration and then see how environmental factors increase the risks above that baseline. And I think what I can show, and I think I eventually convinced people in the room at USAID, that the environmental factors are raising the risks. So if you already have conditions for violence, you're more likely to have them if you have these environmental conflicts. And in the paper that I have on this particular project, I compared the civil violence in Syria and Turkey and Iraq basically before and after this drought period. And I do find that there was a lot of these forms of violence both before and after these river conflicts, and drought exacerbated them, but the amount of violence was higher after the river issues became more predominant. So I basically show that I think it is a kind of multiplier effect for violence rather than being the only factor that causes violence.
You're going to like this, Sarah. Why do you characterize an R of 0.40 as a strong relationship? While there were positive and significant relationships, they did not seem to be too strong. You probably have background information about the larger context for these results that could explain why they are in fact strong results. Can you please tell us about that?
Do they mean for the model as a whole? Who asked that question? Just kidding. Okay, so well, I could go back here, I guess, to the. I don't have an overall model fit statistic, so I guess you're talking about the size of the coefficient. This is a logit model, so you can't really interpret the coefficient directly as a correlation. You have to look at the predicted probabilities. So this is a more accurate representation. So the way to read this would be, for example, if you take armed conflicts, the first line says if you have no river conflicts, the baseline risk of armed conflict when you set all the other variables at their mean is 0.109. So you have about a 1 in 10 chance for any given country year that you'll have armed conflict. If you have one river conflict with your neighbors, that goes from 0.109 to 0.159. So now you have you've increased your risk of armed conflict by over 50% by having a single river conflict. If you go from 0 to 6, 6 is the maximum in our data. So countries like Israel and Jordan have had as many as 6 conflicts. Their risk of armed conflict goes up to 0.627. So I think that's a pretty large effect. You're talking about going from a 1 in 10 chance to a 2 in 3 chance of armed conflict simply by raising the number of river conflicts you have with your neighbors in the region. So from a conflict scholar perspective, I think these are actually really sizable effects and more sizable than I would have guessed that they would be.
This question asks, isn't desalinization too expensive?
No. If Israel can do it, we can do it. Well, I don't know. I need to look into what's happening in California to the extent to which someone was asking me about the West. You were, yeah. So I think it's going to become more important in this country in terms of looking at alternate production of water resources, especially as we're seeing really rapid changes environmentally in our own water supplies in the United States. In Iowa, of course, water quality has been the primary issue rather than quantity, but I think if you see, I've seen some of the models that people like Jerry Schnorr are working on, and they do show that the potential for climate change in Iowa could, in 20 years, generate a climate that looks like Oklahoma. So that does mean that Iowa in the future could face significant changes in water, both water quantity and what we're dealing with today in terms of water quality. But I don't know a lot about the specific costs of this particular technology, but I will look into that more.
Can you please say more about the impact of climate change and drought in causing the civil war in Syria?
Yeah, so in the there's a really good paper. If you email me, I can send you the link. There's a paper that actually tracks or makes the case for why the Syrian civil war was caused by environmental factors, and they look at the drought that happened and then the population displacement as a result of that drought. Now, in that particular paper, the author Beck doesn't really talk about the fact that the GAP project in Turkey had already reduced water supplies in Syria prior to the drought that happened in the mid to late 2000s. So I think climate scholars tend to only look at what's happening inside a country, and they don't tend to look at how transnational aspects of environmental factors matter. And so yet in the Civil War literature, there are a lot of people who study transnational factors, but they tend to study things like refugees. So countries that receive refugees are much more likely to experience civil war themselves. They look at do countries provide safe havens, I can't say this word, for rebel groups? Again, they find that rebel sanctuaries, like Turkey providing rebel sanctuaries, increase the risk of violence in Syria. They look at things like government, diplomatic support between governments, things like that. But in the environmental literature, there's been this real demarcation of people looking either inside a country environmentally, or the river people just looking at government to government conflict and not thinking about civil war. So what I've tried to do is bring these two kind of disparate groups of people that are studying these issues together and think about the transnational aspect of environmental factors.
In those conflicts where there's been violence between upstream and downstream bodies, has the result typically favored one or the other, upstream or downstream, and is there a trend?
Okay, good question. It depends on power. So there's a finding in the river literature that, well, first of all, that the upstream-downstream configuration is more conflict-inducing between countries than the sideways relationship or the river as border relationship, or if the river kind of goes down and comes back up. So in the literature, people try to map the different types of configurations of river borders and then see how that affects violence. And so yes, upstream, downstream is the most likely to produce interstate conflict. However, that's mitigated if you have a powerful state on the basin. So what river scholars call hydrohegemons, that's a great word. So if you have a hydrohegemon like Egypt on the Nile or India on the Ganges, those basins tend to have more cooperation. And India, for example, basically refuses to sign multilateral agreements. It signs a series of mostly bilateral agreements with its neighbors. So these more powerful states, even if they're downstream, if they have a lot of capability advantage over the upstream states, they can get more cooperative river treaties in those situations. But if you have power parity between the countries in the basin, you're more likely to get this kind of violent conflict. Or if the powerful state, like in the Jordan, is, Israel is more powerful. So in some of those situations, you get more violence as well.
Okay. We have one final question. Can you describe more fully the history of the agreements between the countries bordering the Rhine River? So when the first agreements began, did they require war to make them come about, how they came to fruition, etc.?
That's a tough question. I think the Rhine River, the first agreement for the Rhine River, it's like the oldest international organization in the world. So it goes back over 100 years in terms of the original agreement that was signed to manage Rhine resources. The particular quality issue that I was talking about involving Netherlands complaining to the upstream states, that was a more recent case that came, I think that started in the, I don't know, I have to look in our data, but I think in the 70s, 1970s. I have not studied the Rhine case in detail myself, but I my partner in the data set, I was like, oh, I blame my co-author. He coded the Rhine case. So, but yeah, I'll take a look at the history around that particular case.
All right, we now conclude our program. On behalf of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, let's give a big thank you to Sara Mitchell for her presentation. Let me also once again thank our sponsors, University of Iowa International Programs, the UI Honors Program, Stanley University of Iowa Foundation Support Organization, and for today's program, John Menninger and Midwest One Bank. Sara, as a token of our appreciation, I'm happy to present you with the coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug. Thank you, everyone. We're adjourned.